Welcome back to the Sci-Fireplace. These are the science fiction books that I have read of recent, starting from worst to best. Worst, definitely the Ophidian Conspiracy by John Carr. This was a random pick from the Sci-Fireplace here. And every once in a while, maybe, 70% of the time, I do a random pick and it ends up being a very terrible book. And not very terrible, but this one was. This sucked a lot. I made it about 3 pages before I just gave up. Just tripe. John Carr. I don't know anything about it. If I'm wrong on that, let me know in the comments. The next worst was When Harley Was One by David Gerald, which I was excited to randomly pick because of the cover. I thought the cover art was really neato, and the book kind of sucked. It was nominated for both a Nebula and a Hugo, so maybe I suck. However, I don't feel that that is the case. This is quite dated. It was written in 1972, and way more dated than a lot of books that I've read that are much older. It's about a, I also DNF'd this one. I didn't finish it at all. I made it about that far before I stumbled into these awful, like strained metaphors, these terrible little bits of writing comparing the love interest's eyes to a calm ocean, a tropical ocean lapping against a white sand beach or something, and I just put the book down. It's about a computer that attains self-awareness, and it starts doping itself with its own sensory input or something. It feeds data back into itself, so it essentially has like a psychedelic trip, and the scientists are attempting to read the physical printouts of the computer to determine what it is that's going on. I think probably a bit of influence from Flowers for Algernon, a little bit. It's like a computer Flowers for Algernon, and it's set in the near future where grass is legalized, so all the scientists are smoking grass and talking this kind of hepcat jive talk, and it just sucks so bad. I really like older science fiction because typically the prose is much stronger, it's sharper, I think the reading public was more discerning at the time, had higher standards, and read more broadly in other genres as well, and science fiction was laboring to try to get out from under this weight of stigma that surrounded it, of being compared to literary fiction as the redheaded stepchild in the lesser genre. So I think science fiction authors worked harder to inject their writing with real quality, and this was just cliche, uninteresting ideas to me. It was very dated, very, it just had this feeling of the cigarette smoky orange shag carpet 1972 brown wood paneled walls. It just it was just gross to me. Maybe again this is me just being premature and setting it down too early, and if that's the case then I'm willing to be wrong. Next was one I actually liked. It was Masters of Everon by Gordon Dixon, which is in this, I believe, first edition. This could be a book club. I'll check in a moment. Hardcover with this wraparound art. I like books like this that look like this a lot. I'm a sucker for good vintage cover art. I initially didn't care for this all that much. It is really kind of a YA novel almost. It has that feel to it, like a boy's adventure story, and it's like somewhere between Hardy Boys and a Western and a political thriller. So it's about this guy who has a pet. What were they called? They're like big saber-toothed tigers, basically, that are kind of the apex predator on this planet called Everon that's been colonized by humanity, and it's kind of in the early stages of its colonization process. There's some interesting kind of background texture of there's a galactic, I guess, empire or some kind of administrative body that dispenses funding for recently colonized planets, and they have to qualify for that financial and material assistance by meeting certain criteria and applying. And there's been this agrarian settlement where there are different castes of ranchers who are ranching these genetically modified earth animals that have been adapted to the Everon environment. All of these earth species have intermingled with the native species, and it's all lorded over by these big cats, these gigantic predatory cats who the ranchers despise. And this cat has been raised off-world, I think on Earth, and this young man, I think he's like 18, 19 or something, is bringing the cat back to Everon as part of a government-funded experiment to see what would happen if one of the cats was raised off-world. And the cats are unable to open their eyes until they hit adulthood. And this pet cat's growth has been perpetually stunted and has yet to open its eyes, but somehow is able to kind of maneuver its way, seemingly by magic, through the environment and communicate with the protagonist kind of through unknown means. It's a little more boring than it sounds for the first part of the book. It is interesting, and it's very easy to read. It's my first Gordon Dixon, and I thought it was readable. I thought it was pleasant. I didn't think there was all that much happening until the very end, which is this firework of an ending where there's this big, fat sci-fi idea that kind of explodes out of the narrative and ties up a bunch of things that happened earlier in the book. And it's this really intense scene. And it's a little sappy, and it's a little bit kind of purple and on the nose, but it took me totally by surprise. I was fairly blown away by it. I don't read YA, but I don't mind this. And I've seen other people refer to it as YA. That's not just my designation. I liked it. I know that Dorsai is... I think it's out of frame here. It's on the sci-fi place. I have a few other Dixons. Naked to the Stars right here. Probably out of focus, sorry. It's a theme on this channel. Anyway, I would be curious to read more Dixon. I think he's regarded as a quote-unquote conservative science fiction author, and there's a little bit of that flavor that comes through in the book. But strong environmentalist messaging. It feels a lot like Avatar. There's a lot in science fiction that feels a lot like Avatar. Serviceable, decent, solid, good, entertaining science fiction that didn't feel dumb. It didn't feel like kind of cheap entertainment when I was reading it. So, thumbs up. And this was a random pick off the Sci-Fi Place. These next three are all in the great category, and this is a very, very loose ranking. I'm not even going to put that much thought into it because I loved all three of them so much that it kind of hurts my brain to try to parse which one is better than which. So actually, let's do this. I'm just going to pick one at random. I just chose this. I closed my eyes and picked it at random. It's Norstrilia by Cordwainer Smith. My first Cordwainer Smith. This is his only novel. He had a very limited output during his lifetime. He wrote in, I think, a couple different genres. He had a really interesting life, one of the most unusual lives of any science fiction author that I'm aware of. There's a great video on Cordwainer Smith that includes background on this book that was put out by Gregory B. Sadler, who I know from a little bit of cursory philosophy reading. He's best known as kind of a professor who releases these taped lectures about major works of philosophy. I didn't know that he read science fiction and fantasy, and he has a whole video series of these 1 to 2 hour lectures about famous works that are wonderful and fill in a lot of biographical detail. So if you're curious about Cordwainer Smith, I'll link to his video in the description. Really recommend his channel. I was pretty delighted to find out that he did these kinds of videos. His real name was Paul Linnebarger, or Barger, and he worked in foreign intelligence in Asia, had all kinds of influence in foreign affairs during that time, and in fact, Sun Yat-sen was his godfather. So a person of note who wrote science fiction for fun on the side and produced a small but extremely influential body of work in science fiction that all takes place in the same fictional universe called the Instrumentality of Mankind, which is a forerunner of Ian M. Banks and kind of these big universe-spanning galactic empire space opera stories like The Culture. And I read or listened to part of the first novel in the Culture series, and I thought it was really dull. I'm sorry. What was it? Consider Phlebas. So I, you know, have a little bit of the flavor. This is much better, and it was written earlier, obviously. It's a hard book to describe, and it's this melange of, I would say, like a dozen different famous works of science fiction that I kept flashing to as I was reading it. The two names that come to mind to describe this book and Cordwainer Smith are C.S. Lewis and Vernor Vinge. Lewis, because he was a Christian, and there are pretty conspicuous Christian themes in the book, especially towards the end. And he wrote with this kind of soft sentimentalism, which I don't mean pejoratively, but this soft kind of kindliness that evinces C.S. Lewis to me. And Vinge, in that there are so many ideas and premises that are condensed into such a short book, where every few paragraphs or so there's this big idea introduced, and they're all really interesting. It's hard to summarize because there's just so much going on, and he manages to construct such a massive universe in such a short amount of time. And every little conceit that he introduces is totally weird and cool and fascinating. And that doesn't even really do it justice. It's its own animal. I've not read a book like this, and this is one of those books where you're reading it, and I don't know if anybody else does this, but I kept flipping back to the cover to kind of look at it. Like, I can't believe that this small paper object is generating this experience for me. It was one of those books. It opens on a planet called Old North Australia. And Old North Australia, or Norstrilia as it's colloquially known, is accidentally home to the secret to immortality. There are these genetically engineered gigantic sheep that succumbed when the planet was first colonized to a disease that germinates in their fur, kind of this spice melange type substance that renders people immortal. And as a consequence, the planet is rich beyond comprehension, but the local government of the planet decided to limit their material wealth by imposing this massive import tax, this tariff on anything that the residents of the planet buy from off-world. So they are essentially just eternal peasants by choice. They are an agrarian people who just wear simple clothing, and they grow these gigantic sheep, and any one of them have enough wealth if they chose to leave the planet in permanent exile to buy their own fleet of ships and to live as kings, but they choose not to. And because everybody on the planet is immortal, they have to impose this system, almost like a lottery system, where children undergo this trial, and many of them are chosen to be killed with laughing gas. And some of them make it through this crucible to live on, and it's kind of a random happenstance. And the protagonist is this young man, I think he's 17 or 18 in the book, who has tapped out on all of his chances to make it through that process, and is staring down the barrel of the gun of the laughing gas, and is poised to be executed. And he's a freak because he lacks telepathy. So everybody on the planet communicates telepathically, and he can only speak verbally, and occasionally in these world-spanning or miles and miles spanning episodes of generalized telepathy where he can hear everybody's thoughts. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of this book. The first half of the book is some of the finest science fiction I've ever read on all fronts, not just in terms of the quality of the world building, but in terms of the prose, which is really interesting and special. He takes these little liberties with syntax and grammar that are, I'm sure if I sat down and figured out what exactly the tricks were, I could figure it out, but it has this kind of magic in the prose. And it's constantly interrupted with songs and poetry, so it has this Tolkien feel. And it also it feels like Dune a little bit. It's kind of a forerunner, I think, of Dune. Although, no, that's not true, because Dune was written first, right? I don't know. I fully intend to read everything that Smith wrote in science fiction. And that consists of this novel, and then a collection of short stories called The Rediscovery of Man. That's about that thick. And that's all he wrote. Let's talk next about The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad. I happened to get lucky enough to be given this first edition Valentine Timescapes paperback by my friend at Verbatim Books in San Diego, a fine bookseller of note. And this is kind of a tough one to describe. It's an alternate history in which Adolf Hitler never rose to power in Germany, played no direct role in World War II. That didn't happen. Instead emigrated to the United States, where he lived in Greenwich Village and found work as a science fiction illustrator. He painted covers for pulp science fiction novels and produced a critically maligned body of hack science fiction writing until just before his death, he produced this novel called Lord of the Swastika, which is a science fiction retelling of a World War II that never happened, and it takes place in a post-apocalyptic far future where there is an avatar for Hitler. The protagonist of the book is this 6.5 foot tall, blonde, muscle-bound Conan figure, this Ubermensch, who rises into a position of leadership within Helden, which is a stand-in for Germany, which is an enclave of the only genetically pure human stock left in the world after a nuclear war has rendered most human life on the planet into grotesque mutants who are stand-ins for all of the genetically less desirable categories of humans in the mind of Hitler. So there are all kinds of monstrosities who are meant to stand in for various ethnicities and nationalities. And then there are the Doms, the Dominators, which are the science fiction versions of Jews in this imagined world, who are nefarious actors who use trickery and hypnosis and psychic manipulation to control the true humans. And that's the majority of the book, is this science fiction book written by Adolf Hitler. So you're reading a novel written by Spinrad as Hitler. It's one of the finest pieces of satire I've ever read, and obviously this is touchy subject matter and not easily satirized, I don't think, which is one of the criticisms that gets leveled at the book. Like, it's too cheap, it's just too low hanging of fruit for satire, it's too easy, anybody can make fun of fascism and be effective with it, but I completely don't agree with that. I think it's actually a fairly difficult thing to satirize properly, and this is the most cutting and vicious satire of Nazism and kind of the fascist mind that I've ever read. It's written with such aplomb and such subtlety. Spinrad actually had the presence of mind to insert hack writing flourishes, very small ones, into the writing of Hitler repeating stock phrases just one too many times to make it clear that he's not a talented writer. It's a tour through the mind of basically an eternal adolescent who's in love with power, and all of these very conspicuous kind of homoerotic subtexts to a lot of the aesthetics of like the Nazis. Like, Hitler falls in with this gang of Nazi bikers, and they're all muscle bound and wearing leather and studs, and he ends up wielding this mystical scepter that's a truncheon, like this holy truncheon that is described just like a penis. It is another really special book that accomplishes a lot, and it's one of those satires where it's really funny. Like, I would say the first like 50 pages or so, as I was kind of just catching on to what Spinrad was doing and where it was going, I had a smile on my face the whole time, but it's a deeply serious work and really sad. There's a moment in the book where he's describing late in the war his decision to exterminate the captives of war that he's funneled into concentration camps in a conquered, fictionalized Poland, and the way that Hitler frames it as an act of altruism and kind of a material necessity at the time, was sad to the point where I actually choked up when I was reading it. I mean, it's a really sad and dark book that does justice to the subject matter. It did get some heat from people, including Ursula Le Guin, which is interesting. She accused it of being too long, which is apparently the criticism that crops up the most, including on Goodreads. Leave it to Goodreads. And I disagree with that criticism fundamentally. I think that's one of the things that adds to the realism, and it adds to the satire of Hitler just being this redundant blowhard of not having anything really original to say. Also, there's this interesting thing happening in the book where there are really exciting sequences like of battles, the final confrontation with the hordes of this science fantasy Russia. Pretty gripping, and his like initiation into the biker gang was written really thrillingly. So you get a little bit of a taste of what it was that excited these people about these kinds of stories, this kind of all the mysticism, all of the self-aggrandizement. You can kind of get a taste a little bit for why it was effective and what motivated people to be interested in Nazism in the first place, which is an important and difficult thing to do in fiction and any satire. It's to treat it seriously enough to actually portray it accurately and its appeal accurately, and also to inoculate you against it and to condemn it. And also operating underneath all of this is a second meta-satire of pulp, sword, and sorcery stories like Conan, and also right-wing science fiction. It's a great feat. This is a true work of art. I laughed. I almost cried. I know that this is a fairly well-known book, but I really can't believe that it's not better known. Last is Neuromancer by William Gibson, my first read-through. I adore this book, mostly. Surprisingly a divisive book, or maybe not so surprisingly. It's known as being a prescient book. It's known as being a book that foresaw a lot in terms of the development of information technology. It foresaw virtual reality. It foresaw the internet. And this book set the groundwork for all of kind of the aesthetic trappings of cyberpunk. I fell in love with the book immediately, and I thought that I wouldn't really like it. In fact, I was kind of dragging my feet on reading it because I was kind of motivated out of mostly a sense of obligation, really, because it's held forth as one of the great science fiction novels ever, mandatory reading, required reading, and a lot of those books I kind of just don't, I think can be a little bit overrated. Not the case with this. I thought that this was really wonderful. If nothing else, please read Part 1, Chiba City Blues. It is pure distilled cyberpunk in its best form, and I haven't read a whole lot of it, but everything that has followed on from this is very familiar. All the aesthetics of the neon and the wet streets and Japan, that all comes from Chiba City Blues, I think, and this has its fingerprints over everything that followed it. Blade Runner, The Matrix especially. I mean, my God, the more science fiction I read, the more I come to think of the Wachowskis as hacks. And the writing is it's so sharp. It's so hard and sharp and incisive. It's about a hacker, a really esteemed, accomplished hacker who botches a job for his employers, who poison him with this, I think it's a mycotoxin or something, that renders him unable to jack into the Matrix, which is literally what they call it. This shared cyberspace world that's kind of a sensory representation of data systems, private data systems that are owned by corporate entities that are recognizable. There are familiar name brands mentioned in the book. And it's a near future where corporate power is absolute and almost unchallenged. And the hacker lives in a slum in Japan and is addicted to various drugs and works dirty jobs, circling the drain and waiting for death and hoping for death. And then gets recruited for one last big job. And I won't say anything more about it because it'll kind of spoil it. Sounds kind of pat, kind of trite. It's another reading experience that is hard to describe because it's so, this word gritty gets used a lot. This genuinely is very gritty. It's really violent. It's really dark. It's another book that is really dense with ideas, so it's kind of hard to describe, hard to summarize. The reading experience is like watching a really wonderful action movie of that era, of like a Blade Runner or something. I tore through the first half of it. And then it's at the very end, and I've heard a couple other people say this, the very, very end was really slow going for me. And it might just be as a consequence of the fact that I'm a little bit overworked. So by the time I got around to reading the last part, it was right on the knife's edge of consciousness, trying to fall asleep, or about to fall asleep rather. But also, it just, like, the action kind of grinds down to a crawl and gets really confusing right at the end, which is the criticism that I hear the most. It's just terribly hard to follow and confusing. I didn't find that to be the case at all until right at the very end, where the antagonisms didn't really make sense to me, and maybe there wasn't quite enough like context given or backstory provided for the characters and their motivations, the antagonist characters, or maybe I just missed it because I was reading it too quickly, but I just slowed down to a crawl until I finished it. Then the very, very end is great. The way that this book was described to me by a few people who have read it before I read it, it definitely gave me an appetite for more cyberpunk, which is maybe the subgenre of science fiction that I've read the least of. So, would like to read Burning Chrome, would like to read some Bruce Sterling as well. I've taken a little bit of a break from science fiction. I'm reading a nonfiction book, and then I'll jump back into it. I think I'm just gonna cherry pick something and read it. I want to mention I'm following along or taking some guidance from this book, which one of my viewers will probably be very happy to see me hold up. This is science fiction, 100 must-read science fiction novels by Stephen E. Andrews and Nick Renison. And Stephen E. Andrews is the owner and proprietor of the Outlaw Bookseller channel, and he wrote this book in 2006 along with Renison. That's an overview of 100 most influential and historically significant novels in the genre. He has one for fantasy as well, and I kind of have a separate pile set aside that's called Out of the Slop, that are the ones that are mentioned in this book. And it really has yet to steer me wrong. I did try the Lensman books, Triplanetary, which is mentioned, and I'm sure that this is very influential. I found it just not to my taste, but other than that, it's been solid bullseyes, every book that I've picked from this. So if you can find this book, I think it's worth picking up. Yeah, thank you for watching, and I have a feeling that there may be a certain book on the horizon.